Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for just waiting while we waited till 7:35. Welcome to this welcoming Philosophies of the Indigenous Peoples of Northern America event co-hosted by Oxford Philosophy Society and APP. So this event is part of Oxford Public Philosophy's fall/autumn 2023 event series based on themes of our fourth journal, which are Philosophies of Indigenous Peoples of Northern America, Environment and Sentience. And for this event, we are hosting a conversational panel discussion to provide space for learning more about these Indigenous philosophies and the Indigenous peoples of Northern America. As a group doing work in many global philosophies, we recognize that many non-mainstream philosophies are not found within philosophy departments themselves, and also that their study involves transdisciplinary conversation, which will ultimately transform our understandings of philosophy and the world. So we welcome our audience and interdisciplinary panelists to participate in this spirit. And each guest will speak for 10 to 15 minutes, chaired by Professor Welch, before moderating an open Q&A. Welcome to the event, which is being recorded. So we ask you to turn off your camera if you want to make sure that you're definitely not recorded. And I'll let OPS say something about themselves.
Perfect, thank you. So yes, I'm with Oxford Philosophy Society. We're very, very excited to be collaborating with OPP on this event and with all the panelists. So similar to OPP, Oxford Philosophy Society's goal is to introduce students to the world of philosophy outside their studies. So whether that's complementing what is commonly talked about in the Oxford curriculum or trying to go beyond that, like we are now. Whether you are a philosophy student wanting to learn more about different philosophies, or if you're somebody who has never ever studied philosophy and are wanting to, get to know it outside of your schoolwork. So yeah, again, we're really looking forward to getting to host this type of conversation, especially somewhere in Oxford, which is so rooted in a very problematic relationship to the Americas. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. But thank you so much again for coming. Thank you so much for our panelists for coming and talking to us. And I'll pass it back over to you.
Thanks. So just to note on what OPP actually is, it stands for Oxford Public Philosophy, and it's a space for questioning what philosophy is and how we're doing it in form and content. And we welcome work that investigates received assumptions about the nature and aims of philosophical inquiry, including contributions that question structural norms of currently dominant research programs. And we're also really happy to be working with OPS and all our wonderful guests. So with that, thank you everyone for joining us, and I'll hand this over to our chair, Professor Welch. Oh, actually, first I'll introduce Professor Welch. So we'd like to extend a warm welcome to Professor Welch and our speakers. Professor Shay Welch has previously given a lecture for our online course on insurrectionist ethics, and she's also a member of our new circle of advisors, which is comprised of scholars and philosophers from around the world. She is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Spelman College, with interests in embodied cognition, feminist ethics, social epistemology, moral philosophy, Native American and Indigenous philosophy. She's currently working on projects on phenomenology of psychiatry and borderline personality disorder, and on the embodied epistemology of dance, which really caught our imaginations when we were thinking about turn 4 of our journal. And you'll be able to find her work in our upcoming journal. So now I'll hand the spotlight to Professor Welch. Thank you.
Okay, yes, thank you everybody for being at our panel on the Indigenous philosophies of North America. As Alice pointed out, I am currently working on some philosophy of psychiatry for the intersection of trauma and madness, so I am not presenting today. Also save space for some new faces, which I'm excited to see. Everyone's going to get to talk for about 10 minutes. And then one of the things that I wanted to bring to the table as chair is to talk about the importance of the intersection between public philosophy and Indigenous philosophies. And there's been a lot of movement for the visibility of Native and other Indigenous philosophies in the discipline, which is amazing. It's been a long struggle to get it recognized and also incorporated into other people's more mainstream practices. But at the same time, there is also this problem of sort of colonizing within the academy, whether or not you are Indigenous or not. There can be problems of just doing Indigenous scholarship for this distinctive kind of visibility that it can give you, and this creates problems by disconnecting Indigenous ways of knowing with the purpose of Indigenous beings in the world, which is to participate and serve your community. And because Oxford Public Philosophy has this really amazing goal of bringing in marginalized philosophy, I think that it's important to highlight that its emphasis on public philosophies and making philosophy accessible to all kinds of people is in accordance with Indigenous values of serving the members of your community and finding ways to make what you do and the scholarship that you make relevant to everybody's way of being in the world, instead of just sort of another mark on your CV that can get you promotion. So I'm going to have the presenters talk for a little bit, and then I want them to discuss how they see their research contributing to this important goal of indigenizing the academy, and how their scholarship works in relationship to either their community or other communities that they're working on or with. So that's just kind of what I thought I would like to see, which is a little bit selfish, but I think is again in accord with the commitments of Oxford Public Philosophy as well. So with that said, we will have our first speaker, which is Getty Lustula, who is an assistant teaching professor of philosophy and religion at Northeastern University, where, among other things, he teaches on Native American and Indigenous thought. Getty is a philosopher by training, and he received his PhD in philosophy from Boston University in 2019. Getty is also an enrolled member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. He is the founder and organizer of the Indigenous Studies Circle at Northeastern. Getty also sits on the American Philosophical Association's Committee for Native American and Indigenous Philosophers, and is a member of PINE, which is the Philosophy of an Indigenous Education, a team of Native philosophers dedicated to the study and practice of Indigenous pedagogies. They run a twice-monthly reading group and an annual workshop on the legacy of boarding schools in North America. So may I happily introduce Getty.
Hey everyone. I'm going to be pretty informal, and we'll see. I might go more like 5 to 7 minutes. I thought that I just kind of want to set the stage and talk about what it is to be a Native person doing philosophy in a philosophy department. Because one of the striking things is that there are actually very few of us. So along with Professor Welch and I, there's probably about 25 of us who are currently active in terms of people who received PhDs in philosophy, who are currently teaching. And so it's a pretty small world, and for a long time hasn't been a particularly welcoming one. And so for many of us, we've had to live quite a long period of time sort of keeping our scholarship and our personal and family lives quite separate from one another, in terms of we have our traditional teachings, we have our connections with our identity and our tribe, and then we have our sort of scholarship and research on the other hand. Because there are so few resources to study philosophy or to study Indigenous thought in a philosophy department. Now, as Professor Welch pointed out, I do think this is changing. And overall, this is a very positive movement. So for instance, when I came to Northeastern, in my current position, I guess I've been here for about a year and a half now, and proposed a course on Native American and Indigenous philosophy, I got absolutely no pushback at all. In fact, there was a lot of celebration of the idea, and people were very into it, almost to the extent that I was very excited or very sort of surprised by that response. And I think this is overall a good sort of trending in terms of people's greater openness to Indigenous thought, because for a long time, one of the things that held philosophers back from being more welcoming to Native American and Indigenous philosophy is that the way that Native American and Indigenous philosophy is traditionally conducted is not in a way that philosophers would view as philosophical. So the sort of primary medium for philosophy in a contemporary space is an academic article, right? The idea that stories, songs, dance, or whatever could be philosophy was just sort of a very strange thought to philosophers until very recently. And so for a long time, I think the attitude towards Native American and Indigenous thought from the perspective of the philosopher was that stuff might be really cool, but it's not philosophy. And I think that part of it has changed a lot. I think there's been a general openness. So my specialization coming out of graduate school was in 18th century philosophy, where I worked primarily on women and other underrepresented figures during the time who are writing in different kinds of mediums, not the sort of traditional philosophical treatise, letter writing, poetry, and so on. And so there's been movements in other areas of philosophy to open up what might seem as a philosophical medium. And I think that has had a nice positive secondary effect in terms of different areas of human thought that wouldn't have been traditionally recognized as philosophy now are, at least by most people. Now, of course, I think there's a worry here that Professor Welch pointed out. There's a worry, and I think there's like two or threefold, maybe fourfold to the worry. In essence, it comes down to co-opting. So in an academic or philosophical space where there are people who are being trained to get academic positions, there's going to be a tendency to want to write on things that haven't been written on, that haven't been written on 100 times before, right? And so every time any sort of new topic becomes available for the discussion in philosophy, there's going to be a tendency for people, particularly non-native people, to enter into that space, right? Or there could be a tendency in the native context, and to sort of publish a bunch on this material for the purposes of academic advancement, right? And of course, that's a worry, not only sort of generally, because that's just an aspect of scholarship and research that I think that everyone doesn't find exactly tasteful. But there's this deeper problem because we're talking about native thought, native philosophy here. And the worry about the co-opting has a kind of like colonialist feel to it, right? The way in which the academy might sort of take up what might be interesting at a particular period from Native American and Indigenous thought and sort of spit it back out whenever it's done with it, just as it does with just about every other field that becomes attractive for a short period of time. And so there's this kind of worry, I think, from a lot of Native people working in philosophy that, okay, times are good now, but this is going to change, right? And perhaps the times being good now are a sign of worse things to come, because things might be, all of this sort of interesting and important research that we're bringing to the table might end up being sort of watered down and repackaged in ways where our presence isn't even necessary anymore. And so I think that there's a lot of kind of double-mindedness right now amongst Native people who are working in philosophy. Though I think because of this, there are some people who have a philosophy background who are going to work in other fields where this is going to be sort of less of a concern, because there's more room for Native peoples working in those spaces, whether it's in Native studies departments, whether it's in sociology departments, whether it's in anthropology departments, whether it's history departments, whatever, right? And So I think as a Native person working in philosophy, you're in this position where you're faced with the decision to either continue in a field where there are very few of you, and there's this worry about co-opting, and there's so few numbers that there's a worry that you could get swallowed up very easily, or essentially jumping ship and going to a more, I think, welcoming and comfortable environment in which to do your teaching and research. And that's a decision that each of us have been faced with, and I think continue to be faced with on a daily, weekly, or job cycle sort of basis. And I do think, even though I'm sort of highlighting some of the concerns that one might have here, that these movements are overall optimistic. And I think the optimism that I feel is there's an extraordinary amount of interest amongst young people in these topics. Young people who did not receive a lot of education around Native issues, understandably, right, from the public education system, or even whatever their background might be, who are, for the most part, I think, extraordinarily interested with a good mind and good heart, just wanting to learn, just wanting to understand. And I think along with that, also wanting to do better. And so I think I think there's more than just this, but I think one of the sort of glimmers of hope that I see through all of this, on top of the fact that there's just a more welcoming environment, is that I think that we can, by teaching these issues in a classroom, have a really big impact on people's attitudes. And when they're going on to whatever career that they're going on into, say in Northeastern, for instance, I teach a lot of kids that are going to go into law school and things like this. They're going to be taking some knowledge of Native issues and Native thought with them, so that going forward, they're not going to be able to really make decisions that impact other people without also in the back of their mind remembering that there are also other people out there, and in this sense, the Native people who are impacted by their actions. And so I think it creates this greater sense of visibility, and I see that movement going forward, and I think that's pretty positive. So I guess I'll probably stop there and get to Shay's question and then move on to everyone else.
Great, thank you. Yeah, you caught me looking at the clock, huh? Yeah, so I think you raised some important points, and yeah, the interesting thing that I think that's happening in philosophy with the younger generation, and it's both sad and wonderful, is that there are so many more opportunities now for young people to actually get formal training in philosophy while also being able to get training in Native studies in terms of language revitalization, being able to do major projects in basket weaving, right, which we're familiar with, and other kinds of exciting things. And I think this is where philosophy is getting, or is butting heads a little bit with the academy and with mainstream philosophy in general, because when some of the older camp was doing Native philosophy as a development project, and we were doing it in sort of analytic terms that marked us as philosophers, but developing and making visible Indigenous ways of knowing, that was kind of like, yeah, this is neat, this is still philosophy, this is good. And the younger people are coming in and they're like, okay, so now I know I have the philosophy, like the analytic philosophy of Indigenous epistemologies. Now let me learn more about doing traditional Indigenous ways of knowing. And that is getting some conflict within philosophy departments, because they want Indigenous people to do analytic philosophy and teach these classes, but they also have a really hard time. I know that this has been a little confusing at my school with it, articulating student learning outcomes for doing art as a philosophical position. And so I'm just interested in what you would have to say about how professors of Native and Indigenous philosophy, regardless of if you're Native or not, how do you think that they can help indigenize philosophy through their students, right? Because I feel that one of the ways that we are making good marks on the world is by contributing to community, by building community, by teaching our students how to know in Indigenous ways. And so I'm curious about how you like to go about this with your students, and also whether or not you're getting pushback from your department on traditional ways of knowing.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think when it comes to, I think, so I'm thinking about like assignment structure. Like, so when you're mentioning learning outcomes of doing art, for instance, I think I also, when I'm teaching Native American Indigenous philosophy, I try to do, well, I do more sort of what I would say experientially based assignments, where students are engaging with community or engaging in the natural world and these kinds of things that, of course, to a traditional philosopher are going to seem lightweight. We'll put it that way, right? That's and I think I haven't received a lot of formal pushback. I think certainly there are some people in the department who see that as lightweight, for instance. But I think in general, what I've seen is outside of native thought, deeper thinking about how we do assessment and potentially moving beyond the traditional kind of paper model, which then allows for more space to build interesting experientially based assignments that then get the students to expect that that's part of a class, which I think then puts pressure on professors when they're thinking about course construction as well. I think as well with like you said, when it comes to community, trying to get them to think about, I think they have a tendency to think about work and productivity around grades and around fulfilling learning outcomes in a formal sense, but trying to get them to see that the work of every day when it comes to engaging with their community and the world around them is just as much work, and also even perhaps more important, I think more important, when it comes to them having like really fulfilling learning experiences, whether here at college and also just beyond that. So yeah.
Great, thank you. Thank you for your talk. Okay, next on our list is Susanna Cole, who is a Mexican doctoral student of anthropology at the University of Oxford. She's actually over there. Her research focuses on Totonac conceptualizations and experiences of diabetes and high blood pressure in Puebla, Mexico, which bring together local knowledges about the environment, infrastructure, food, and affect in specific ways. Susanna began her research in 2012 during her master's in anthropology at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, after studying for a degree in English and social anthropology at the University of St. Andrews. So, Susanna.
Thank you so much, Shay, and thank you to everybody for being here. I have been thinking a lot about what my experience could bring to this discussion as an anthropologist. And I landed on two main thoughts. So first, in the world of English language publication, at least, the study of Mesoamerican philosophical thought has focused almost entirely on pre-colonial times, whereas emerging work on philosophies of the indigenous peoples living in Mexico today have been primarily published in Spanish. So in that sense, my research focuses on Totonac conceptualizations of disease, environment, and sociality in relation to diabetes, as they are sort of coming into context today in Puebla's highlands. And secondly, I want to talk a little bit about what it might mean to sort of understand and think with complex indigenous theories and methodologies as an early career researcher or activist. I'm just going to share my presentation to give a few visuals here. Okay. So in 2012, I traveled to a town in Puebla with a friend, and the family she was staying with kindly suggested that I study a master's in anthropology and come stay with them. So I did that. And at the time, the only hospital in that region had just opened, and it had begun a diabetes and hypertension detection program. So most families suddenly had at least one family member with a chronic disease. And the experiences that they shared with me sort of led me to focus on this topic, which I have been researching since then. And I have just returned from a year there as part of my doctoral program here at the University of Oxford. So I want to talk about my initial experience. At the time, I quickly became aware that people in the town shared common knowledge about the causes of this disease, which was unrelated to the information being provided by the hospital staff. And I pretty quickly also discovered that when it comes to issues of disease and medicine, hospital staff and many academic interlocutors would reduce this local knowledge to beliefs that could or even should be educated away. So during my master's, I joined a seminar that was focused on reading the works of Marilyn Strathern, Bruno Latour, Viveiros de Castro, Aparecida Vilaza, and other proponents of anthropological ways of approaching sort of indigenous life worlds without understanding them as different representations of a single natural world, to which implicitly or explicitly science has an epistemologically privileged access. You know, these authors have been associated with the so-called ontological turn in anthropology, which can and has been critiqued, of course, but at the time it really gave me a way forward. In what way? The idea was that by constituting interlocutors, my friends, the people I was talking to, not as research objects nor subjects, but rather as theoretical agents, in the words of Viveiros de Castro, ethnography, sort of the hallmark of anthropology, ceases to be the academic's interpretation of data through anthropological theory and becomes a co-production of theory that arises from the often equivocal relationship between people. And moreover, these ethnographic theories could shift what is considered to be given and what is considered to be constructed in any given context or set of relationships. In my case, however, as a non-Totonac Mexican white woman beginning my research with a very rudimentary understanding of the language, aspiring to the co-production of theory or ethnographic theory was not, I would argue, something attainable. The authors I was reading had spent over 20 years thinking with the people that they worked with. So instead, adopting this methodological and ethical position towards the work I was doing meant sort of openly discussing and always continuously doubting my assumptions and focusing only on day-to-day interactions and the reality premises that they pointed to in each context. Yeah. So I want to use the next 5 minutes to describe 2 examples from my time in Puebla of the sort of equivocations in Viveiros de Castro's terms that I'm referring to. One that seems to be confused with agreement, and one that sort of routinely leads to moments of tension and anxiety in people's lives. The first refers to the fact that diabetes is caused by susto, which in English would translate as fright, in Totonac is pecua. And this is not only common knowledge actually in the town I worked in, but actually across Mexico, both in indigenous and non-indigenous communities. Now, in my interactions with international interlocutors, upon mentioning this fact, I've come to expect sort of a sense of agreement, like, well, of course. And they'll reference hormone levels, the fight or flight response, more generally stress. And so this comparison between susto and stress has also become common in anthropological literature on diabetes. Now, obviously, there's something very problematic about a tendency to confirm indigenous or types of local knowledge with scientific findings, but I won't go into that now. For now, I just want to dwell on this comparison. So susto is a sickness that is caused by a frightening occurrence. So when someone slips, for example, or encounters a snake, their spirit can remain in that location, trapped by sort of the non-human master or owner of the water or earth. In Puebla, where I've worked, the susto that causes diabetes has come to be seen as more severe, like terrible car accidents or being robbed at gunpoint, for example. Now, these types of death and violence have become more common since the arrival of the highway in '84. And simultaneously, cases of susto in the forest have become less common because deforestation has pushed the master of the forest further away. Now, interestingly, these environmental changes are also linked to the understanding of the collective causes of diabetes. Because most, if not all, actually the people that I've spoken to during these years agree that there didn't used to be diabetes in the region, but that it arrived together with the highway and the concomitant influx of chemicals, specifically those that are injected into animal produce to increase production, and the pesticides introduced by the government when they implemented a coffee monoculture program in the region. So what we see here is a series of socio-environmental transformations brought about by generally desired and approved infrastructural projects, but which also introduce chronic diseases to the town and have changed the very nature of the experience of frights that can lead to diabetes in an individual. Now, I know that was a lot in little time, but what becomes clear when focusing on this local knowledge about the disease is that susto is not stress. Susto points to a concept of a person that has multiple spirits that can stop moving, be trapped, and even killed. And it points to specific ways of understanding the individual person's life in relation to the town and land that he or she lives in. Whereas stress conjures up a body imagined as hormonal, as the product of an evolutionary process, which reacts as it did thousands of years ago when escaping predators or other life-threatening situations. So while this equivocation can and is commonly confused with agreement, and therefore might actually be useful in negotiations or applied projects working with the biomedical community, it is crucial to understand that they're not the same thing to avoid sort of reducing one to the other and avoid epistemological violence. The second example that I want to discuss actually does lead to tension in the lives of the people that I've worked with, and that is the prescribed diet for diabetes. So research on the soaring rates of diabetes in Indigenous communities in the US and Canada has highlighted the ways in which dispossession, displacement, in the environmental destruction sort of by colonialist nation states cut off access to traditional foods and ways of eating. In Mexico, colonialism and systemic violence have played a similar role, but follow different pathways so that the people in the town that I work in are living in their ancestral lands and mostly eat the foods that their grandparents ate. However, these foods are nonetheless different because they contain chemicals. And in addition, Coca-Cola has become the main beverage for many young men working in the fields, and children have added processed foods and sweets to their diets. So the doctors at the hospital follow the National Diabetes Treatment Guidelines based on medication and lifestyle changes, which were designed mostly with an urban context in mind. Thus, from day one, doctors were having to adapt the recommended foods to the local diet, which consists mainly of tortilla, accompanied by beans, chile, wild greens, coffee, and occasionally meat. So consequently, the main recommendation became cutting down on the consumption of tortilla, sometimes drastically. And so most of the people suffering from diabetes at the time were really deeply worried because they trusted doctors to have knowledge that they did not about these diseases, but they were being instructed to stop eating the very food that makes them healthy and is their source of strength. So in these moments of anxiety, a tortilla was two things, a homonym. It was a carbohydrate that would raise glucose levels and the only food that truly nourishes a person and allows them to work. So it is important to note that if we approach these encounters with the assumption that there are different knowledges, philosophies at play, which may operate along different principles and point to different concepts of body and sociality, then these tensions cannot be framed as sort of simple misunderstandings that can be explained away. And especially considering that the biomedical sort of system and the hospital staff can, in many cases, hold more power. So whether these accounts point to or have the potential to co-produce theories from the perspective of Totonac philosophies, I'm unable to say. But I do believe that they shed light on dynamic local knowledge of the relationship between food, infrastructure, the entities that populate the environment, and the bodies, spirits, and day-to-day lives of people affected with diabetes. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much for your talk. I guess one question that I have relevant to our theme of public philosophies might be, how do you think that this work in ethnography might be able to help revise the way that these local hospitals are implementing their diabetes treatment programs, right? So it might be the case that nothing nothing truly can be done about sort of the Diabetes Association and how they recommend their diets and things like that. But for the local peoples and the local hospitals and people who partake already in these Indigenous ways of knowing, how can anthropology help them resist these sort of colonizing health practices that actually perpetuate illness within the community?
Thank you. So there's
We've got a
sorry, I think yes, am I back?
You are back.
Sorry, technical issues. There are two ways to answer that. First, locally, we are actually trying to work on creating a bit of a guide for people who come to work in the hospital. I mean, doctors change every 3 to 4 months in the system, but the hospital director is very open to having someone actually come and describe the situation that we are that I just talked about, and see what can be done. However, as you say, there's the sense that only so much can be done, because at the end of the day, tortilla is carbohydrate, and this is, for the health of the person. So in the longer, sort of more wider perspective, we have seen this type of argument work in political settings of land defense and territory defense in Mexico. And so we're hoping in the long run to be able to use this research to justify further research that actually does focus on what types of foods are available in rural areas, not only here, because this is actually a situation of more urban versus rural, and rural people, that's millions of people. So there does seem to be, I feel quite hopeful and positive, maybe also because of the specific political situation that we're living in Mexico, that this could lead to further research on how to adapt the diet, which not only considers the nutrition of ingredients, if you want to call them that, that haven't been studied before, but also the ways in which this food is linked to sociality, the environment, and the body. Now, again, this is the longer term, but when I say we, I'm talking about several families that I've been working with and people that have shown interest in working with me to try to argue and advocate for this change, with some tensions that have to do with this autocolonialism and this history of colonialism in Mexico, in which, for example, the wild greens have come to be seen as a sign of poverty and something to be embarrassed of. So if the doctors recommend them, it is taken as insulting almost. So there are other aspects that I didn't really get into, but we are trying together to come up with both a local and then a long-term sort of policy change project for this diet, at least, which is something that one can point to that could benefit or at least improve the lives of people on a day-to-day basis.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next up, we have Dan Cooper. He's a geography, environmental studies, and social science lecturer at California State University, San Marcos, and San Diego State University. He has a BA from Hamilton College and MA from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and a DPhil from the School of Geography and Environment at St. Anthony's College at the University of Oxford. He has worked as a consultant for the World Bank, United Nations, and International Labor Organization. His research is composed of two primary streams that often overlap and converge. The first is focused on global perspectives, and the second is an ethnographic thread that is participatory, bottom-up action approaches to document and analyze traditional knowledges. Additional interests include Native North American, just North American social movements, and Indigenous communities, focusing specifically on colonial and missionary histories, resistance, rewilding, and revitalization. Ooh, it's a mouthful. All right, Dan, your turn.
Okay. Can everybody see here? Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am currently a guest on the occupied and traditional unceded territory and homelands of the Luiseño, Payom Kuichum, and Kumeyaay people in what is currently known as San Diego, down in this area. Thank you to everyone who helped organize this exciting event, and to those of you who are choosing to participate. I am a non-Indigenous human geographer focused on different perceptions of space. I use ethnogeographic, spiritual geographical, and psychogeographical frameworks to analyze the dialectic exchanges that compose landscape, with a particular emphasis on spiritual and religious beliefs and practices other than human beings, missionary histories, revitalization, as well as movements for social, environmental, climate, and spatial justice. I grew up on Old Rancheria Road, 2 miles down a dirt road from Rancho Nicasio in West Marin, California, which is up in this area. Before the Spanish, Mexican, and American periods of California history, this land was known as Etkatamal, which means beneath the mountain in Coast Miwok dialect. I grew up finding arrowheads and other artifacts, but I didn't see any of the Coast Miwok when I was growing up. Although I was born and raised in California, and I'm currently based in San Diego, my most relevant experience and knowledge of Indigenous philosophy comes from South America and the Akawayo people of the Guyana Highlands. I do not intend to extend, project, or conflate the beliefs and practices of the communities that I visited in South America with those of North America. The data presented here were collected after thorough risk, ethics, and permitting processes, including the necessary receipt of free, prior, and informed consent from village councils, government officials, and other gatekeepers and owners of traditional knowledge and resources. I utilize participatory action research methods. The following presentation is intended to juxtapose different frameworks that are both exogenously and endogenously determined. Through my research, teaching, and this presentation, I aim to deepen and extend a theoretical space for the analysis of Indigenous ontology, geontology, and geontopower that are at the center of our ideas of life and non-life, being and non-being. Under settler colonialism and neoliberalism, a rock, mountain, lake, or fossil are non-life and non-being and are therefore unworthy of care or justice. Before departing for fieldwork in Guyana, I saw a few maps of Amazonia that showed a stark contrast between the deforestation in indigenous territories and the surrounding areas. I hypothesized that this difference was largely due to the spiritual beliefs, perceptions, and environmental ethics of the indigenous peoples compared to the predominantly monotheistic, capitalist, and privatized perspectives of the land that was clearly leading to deforestation outside the indigenous territories. Here in the map, you can see areas of red being deforested, and within the indigenous territory, the environment remains relatively intact. Here's another map from the Xingu territory in Brazil, which shows a similar pattern of deforestation outside the indigenous territory and an intact landscape within. The central focus of my multi-sided ethnogeographic fieldwork was the Mount Roraima landscape that transcends Guyana, Brazil, and Venezuela. This is Mount Roraima. The first written reference to Mount Roraima was by Sir Walter Raleigh a former student of Oriel College, Oxford, who traveled through the region in 1595 in search of El Dorado, the fabled city of Manoa, or the lost city of gold. In his fanciful publication, The Discovery of Guyana, in 1596, he referred to Mount Roraima as a mountain of crystal. In 1884, the English explorer and botanist Sir Everard I.M. Thurn, educated at Marlborough College, an honorary fellow of Exeter College, Oxford, successfully climbed Mount Roraima on an expedition sponsored by the Royal Geographical Society. Many believe that I.M. Thurn's vivid descriptions of the Guyana Highlands inspired Sir Arthur Conan Doyle to write The Lost World in 1912, about the discovery of a living prehistoric world full of dinosaurs and primeval plants. More recently, the Pixar animated film Up was created, based largely on the same Pacaraima mountain landscape. However, these are all exogenous, European, or colonial narratives. According to local indigenous ontology, Mount Roraima is a stump of an ancient tree of life that once held all the fruits and vegetables of the world. Macunaíma and Chigu are twin creation heroes, born from a sun-father, Way, filled with aqua, radiant light energy, and a cool earth mother, Nosoro, and her dark energy known as Ewarupa. Their son, Macunaíma, represents stasis, while Chigu is a force of agitation. At a time of great hunger, the boys decided to chop down the Wayaga using a toucan's beak, and the giant magical tree fell to the northeast in the direction of present-day Guyana, causing a great flood of water to spew forth from the trunk, carrying fish and rivers that covered many animals and turned them to stone, and dispersed bananas, pineapples, sugarcane, cassava, manioc, sweet potatoes, and all other foods to distant parts of the world. This is an image of a cosmogram that I collaboratively created with the Akawayo as a conceptual depiction of their universe. Here at the center is the tree of life, the Wayaga, and the stump, and an above world filled with aqua, radiant light energy, and Ewarupa, a dark energy. Among other things, the felling of the giant tree of life and the remaining stump represents the advent of Swidden agriculture, life's inextricable link to water, food, and the land, and the dangerous, spoiled nature of the world that Macunaíma and Chigu left behind, with people, animals, and spirits speaking different languages and taking on primarily antagonistic relationships. Just before the giant Wayaga, tree of life, fell, it asked each of the three main rivers in the region if they wanted Pataewang. This is the northeast, and these are the three rivers that are referenced. First, Kukuyame, a female name referring to the Kukui River, answered, "Yes, I want a little fertile land." Then Kamurani, a female name for the Kemarang River, was asked if she wanted Pataewang, and she answered yes, a lot. Finally, Mazurime, a female name for the Mazaruni River, was asked but she didn't answer. Consequently, the land along the Kukui has some fertile land, while the Kemarang has a lot of Pataewang, and the Mazaruni has the least fertile soil along her banks. In the Akawayo worldview, the land is not only alive and animate, it is also filled with myriad other than human beings that speak different languages and can be both helpful and harmful to humans. The following story, known as a pandong, illustrates an encounter with a local master owner of animals, places, and resources in the landscape known as Piaitma or Bush Taitai. a giant, hairy, anthropomorphic manifestation of the land. This story comes from an elder named Geronimo Thompson. A young man who had just trimmed his hair very short went hunting with his blowpipe. Piait-Ma saw the man in the forest and asked him how he cut his hair so short. The young man responded by saying that he used wato, a flint stone that gets real sharp. Then he told Piait-Ma that in order to get such a nice haircut, they had to cut his scalp, peel his skin off, and put pepper inside. Piait-Ma admired the man's haircut so much that he said he wanted it done to him. The man said, "Okay, but you can't complain." Then he cut Piait-Ma, peeled off his scalp, and rubbed pepper on his head. It hurt Piait-Ma so much that he ran away. Sometime later, pepper began to grow on his head. He wanted to get revenge, but he couldn't move. Now you can find this particular kind of wild Piait-Ma pepper growing all over the land. Despite the endurance of this story and the animist conceptual system that it suggests, these pantoni, or stories, and ontologies are endangered. When Europeans arrived in the New World, their effort to quote-unquote conquer the land and its peoples were driven by Christian dogma that divorced humans from the larger earth community. According to the Bible, in Genesis 1:28, quote, "And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth," end quote. With God's blessing, Europeans flocked to the Western Hemisphere in search of gold and other resources to, quote unquote, subdue. They marginalized the, quote, savage and, quote, uncivilized inhabitants of the land, using missions, foreign capital, and technologies to coerce, enslave, and proselytize. Many indigenous spiritual beliefs and healers were associated with the devil and subordinated in every way. These examples present the clear clash of Western and indigenous ontologies that proliferate. I have spent my professional and academic career trying to build a theoretical bridge between indigenous and Western ontology. Despite some progress, there is much more work to be done, especially in the fields of linguistics, ethnomusicology, ethnobotany, ethnozoology, toponymy, and philosophy. It is my hope and prayer that this discourse will lead to a reimagination of many of our core assumptions that continue to erode justice and peace. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Dan. I guess you're going to get the same question. I would be interested to know how it is that your collaborations with the locals in making this bridge between different ontologies contributes to their community needs.
Yeah, thank you for that wonderful question. You know, where I did my doctoral fieldwork down in Amazonia here, it's very much a frontier state, very much like North America was a few hundred years ago, where there's a lot of gold mining and very ugly social challenges, let's just say. And part of the challenge is that there are a lot of overlapping land titles within this territory that I visited and elsewhere. And so I utilized participatory action research as a non-Indigenous scholar who was invited and welcomed into these communities. I wanted to address the issues that they wanted me to address. And forefront in their mind were the land titling litigations that were currently being debated in the courthouses of the capital in Georgetown. And so I was asked by the Akawayo to help them map out their territory, both physically and conceptually, in order to provide them with evidence of their ancestral ties to the land. And so I think that's really what my value added, hopefully, has been. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Great, thank you. I know that the land title complications are pretty ravaging for the local communities, and so it's always good to hear that there's somebody who's helping them navigate that and fight that fight. So I'm sure that your labors were greatly appreciated. All right, do we have one more? Yes, Judy. Judy Ramos is Tlingit from Alaska. She is Assistant Faculty Northwest Coast Arts and former program coordinator of Our Language Pathways at the University of Alaska Southeast. She was an assistant professor in the Department of Alaska Native Studies and Rural Development at the University of Alaska. She has a BA in anthropology and MA in teaching and is working on a PhD in Indigenous studies. She has worked for the Tlingit tribe as an anthropologist. She is also the co-curator for the Northwest Coast Hall renovation at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. Her publications include Tlingit Hunting on the Edge, Ice Floe Harbor Seal, and the hunting, I'm sorry, I think there might be a misspelling on my end, the Huntington Bay in Alaska, Arctic Crashes, People and Animals in the Changing North for the Washington and Smithsonian Scholarly Press, and Traditional Ecological Knowledge of Tlingit People concerning the sockeye salmon fishery in the Dry Bay area. And this was written with Rachel Mason. So welcome, Judy, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Oh goodness, geez. So I am very pleased and happy to be here. Let me just go ahead and start my my slides. So I just wanted to when I was thinking about my talk, I thought of the words of Robert Davidson. He's a famous Haida artist. And he said during the Holocaust, he felt that we lost our greatest philosophers because 90% of the Haidas were lost during the epidemics. He did co-write with his daughter a book called Paul Lash's Pedagogy, Learning Through Ceremony. So when I was thinking about our ways of being and doing, and our ways of thinking about the world, I thought of our relationship to the world around us through Raven stories. So I wanted to talk a little bit about our Raven stories and how that fits into how we in Alaska think about the world. I wanted to acknowledge that I live and work on the land of the Akwaan in Tlingit Ani, past and present. This is a photo of my community, Yakutat. We face the Pacific Ocean, and on one side is Mount St. Elias, which is 18,008 feet, and Malaspina Glacier, which is about the size of Rhode Island, so very glaciated area. Just myself, I'm Tlingit, and also have roots in the Eyak people of Raven. My clan is the Humpback Salmon Clan. I'm daughter of the Coho Salmon Clan, and I'm granddaughter of the Brown Bear Takeaway Clan. So when I was thinking about how we view the world around us, I was thinking about Robin Wright, who said that each tribe or nation has their own unique vision or cosmology of how the universe came into being, how it's structured and shapes our human behaviors in life. And she said that beliefs are transmitted mainly through oral narratives, rituals, and our ceremonies. So we're Tlingit people are a clan-based society, so we all have our own stories about how we came to where we are. And we have a long narrative in my clan about how we arrived where we are. And along the migration route, each of those places we encountered sacred entities or animals. So Mount St. Elias to us is a sacred entity. And so we took Mount St. Elias as an emblem of who we are as a people. So we're the children of Mount St. Elias. We wear Mount St. Elias honor regalia, and it's very much part of our stories and ceremonies. She also said there's no similarity or unifying belief between Indigenous religious traditions because each group has their own set of beliefs. So she said Native traditions share some of the following features of their worldviews, the importance of their sacred lands, and sacred sites that are connected to the past stories of their cosmology, the mythic times, we call it distance time, places of power, which these places of power are originating life force of our ancestors. And the ceremony, a lot of ceremonies are based on the renewal of this power. So also great emphasis is based on our kinship orientation. So also humans and other beings like animals and our people, the mountains and glaciers have souls, and their ways of life or cultures are believed to be very similar. And they have their own homes and villages that they live in. So also all beings are animate and exercise intent. However, the bodies of non-human beings, like animals and fish and stones, differ from humans and amongst themselves. Also, these beings' perceptions of the life around them and senses of time and space vary. So within their own worlds, their perceptions of the world around them are called biologically, historically, and culture situated. So when we see an animal like behaving like an animal in their own worldview, they see themselves as kind of living human-like in their own worlds. One of the stories I wanted to share was the Koyukon Athabascans' view of the world. So they view, they call it everything is animate and aware. The whole world around them, the trees and everything is animate and aware. And they can feel and also be offended. So there's also, when we have a relationship with the natural world around them, there's a moral code that maintains the proper spiritual relationship between humans and the spiritual world, the animals. So if you violate any of these codes, it could be affect your health or in wellness, and so you have to maintain a proper balance with the world around them. In the Koyukon beliefs, everything goes back to a time which is called the distance time. So this is the stories have an oral history of the Koyukon people and their environments before the present world of existence. So during that time, all the animals were human-like, and most of the times it's during the flood. All the humans died and were transformed in to the animal or plant beings that we see them today. These dreamlike metaphors left a residue of human qualities and personality traits in the animals. So there's stories about why certain animals behave certain ways or have certain powers. So central to all the native peoples of Alaska is a raven. So he's seen as a trickster, but also as a deity. And he manipulated the world around them, the natural design of the world to suit his whim or fancy. So the Koyukon, has stories about why the rivers flow a certain way, which is the raven made it flow that way. And there's hundreds of stories explaining the behavior of living things, animals and plants. And at the distance time, there was a flood, and after the flood, the animals and plants could no longer communicate to us in their language. And that's about the time when humans are created during that time. In the Eskimo tradition, they call it when the Earth's crust was thin. Also in this relationship, all animals, some plants, and some inanimate things have spirits that protect the welfare of their material counterparts. They're watchful for insulting or wasteful behavior. So we have certain codes of not wasting anything and proper respect to the world around us. So there's all these rules or taboos. They call it hutlani in the Athabascan language. Some apply to just one species and together have much more general effects. So the animals have three categories of hutlani. First is the treatment of all living organisms. Second, the treatment of the organism or parts of the organism of the animal that are no longer alive. And the third, the treatment of non-living entities like objects. So this is a really short presentation of this spirituality. I also wanted to bring up the work of this book, Stop Talking, Indigenous Way of Teaching and Learning and Difficult Dialogues in Higher Education. And Dr. Quagley, who was the philosopher for the Indigenous Studies program at the university, and some other elders had a meeting, and they put together this set of a dialogue on how to make the university more Indigenous. So I wanted to kind of share their work because I think the important points they have in there about how to indigenize the academy is in that book. So that's what I wanted to share with you. So Ganeshish, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Judy. That was wonderful. I'm curious how you think that Indigenous studies might have some way of, or let me ask this question. Do you think that Indigenous studies brings more to non-Indigenous peoples given the close relationship with the community, or do you think that Indigenous studies, like a PhD in Indigenous studies, provides special skills that allows scholars to go back into the community to educate their community about their own symbols and beliefs in different ways from different perspectives?
Can you repeat the question one more time?
Yeah. Or I'll make it shorter. Do you think that the discipline of Indigenous studies allows people to understand their symbols and ways of knowing in unique ways that are helpful to take back to the community? Or do you think that the community sort of provides the main content for Indigenous studies where people then take that to other academics?
So I found it more useful in my research to kind of decolonize my mind about the way I look at research, because I was very happy when I started reading Linda Toohey-Smith's work and say, well, I can study and do research with my own ways of knowing and being, and not have to do it through a academic discipline, because I had been schooled in the field of anthropology, and it was kind of like awareness and an aha moment for me, just to be able to communicate my communities, my research which is based on researching the seal studies from an Indigenous perspective. So I found it most useful for doing research within my own community. And I don't know if the Academy is really prepared for that, but I think slowly through co-production of knowledge that I'm working with the Science National Science Academy on here, this co-production of knowledge to kind of bring in our ways of looking at the world into their do it as a co-produced knowledge. And how does that look like? I think is mostly valuable to me as a researcher.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I guess we have a few minutes for some open Q&A. So if anybody wants to put their question in the chat, we've got some time. Anybody have any comments or want to share some similarities in research or thinking?
I have a question.
Can I just, sorry.
Madeline, you go ahead.
I was going to say, can I just ask it instead of typing it? Would that be okay?
I think right now we can go ahead and do that. Sure.
Great. I am a K through 12 teacher in the US. And so thinking about how some of these philosophies and practices can translate into the like K through 12 classroom, I'd be curious to hear anybody's sort of thought processing on that, particularly around like elevating, and not that it's my job as a teacher to like legitimate things, but like I guess encouraging my students to legitimate for themselves their own folk knowledge, community knowledge, and ways of being. Some practices that might look like for like 12-year-olds as opposed to like 18-year-olds. Not that they're that different sometimes, but I would just be curious to hear some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, any way of getting them out on the land and seeing nature, I think would be really helpful, but also seeing how they're related to the world around them and the environment around them. I think but just spending for the stop talking when they recommend spending like at least an hour out in nature and being quiet and just listening to nature is probably a really good beginning. And there were some really good recommendations in that book about indigenizing the education through, yeah, thank you.
Well, I guess I would
Yeah.
just, oh, go ahead, Getty.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I do something similar like with college students, and I think it works well. I think it's deeply uncomfortable for them in the sense that they're not used to doing that, and also just because of their phone addiction. So I make them like go and like sit and just like not do anything. And I think like part of them hates it, but also like I think they recognize that it's weird that it's uncomfortable for them, and then that's like also interesting. So I think following sort of Judy's point, I feel like it's a good exercise. I try to remind myself to do that too more. Yeah.
You know, one thing that I focus on a bit in my teaching in liberal studies. Most of my students are aspiring educators. And here in California, we have something called the Mission Project, which focuses on the California mission history. And that's usually taught at the 4th grade level. And I'm continually surprised at the awareness of college level students and their lack of awareness and understanding of history. And I don't necessarily have an answer, but more of a question about when and how is it appropriate to teach about the true history of colonization of the Americas. And this is something that we debate all the time, and I honestly don't have an answer, but I'm trying to think of these ways. And I think what the previous speakers were suggesting, exposing people to nature, talking about oral histories and the value of elders and ties to the land come to mind, but I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, that Indigenous studies is a requirement at our university, which I'm teaching this semester, about the genocide and all that is a required class for students in our campus.
Great. All right, Lee McBride, one of our key members, he's asking a question which is almost similar to what I was getting at with Judy, which is whether or not you have to code switch between talking to your local community and talking to your academic community, and how well that works out. Whether or not anybody's interested in both sides of the same story, and whether or not you can communicate the same idea with the same significance to both sets of people, communities.
Can I just add also, I mean, I put in there about ontologies, because I think in most of your talks, there's something about there's differing ontologies, that certain ideas don't fit neatly back in the people's discussions. And so how do you do that, sort of going from, doing my scholarship and wanting to publish versus talking to regular folks, and do the ontologies mix, or how do you operate there? Thanks, Shay.
Yeah, it's different. It's quite different of explaining research to your own community versus the academic. And I had some difficulties working with my co-PI who I said, well, people have their own rhythm in the community, and matching the rhythm of the required research, they have their own timeline when you're working with the academic to get in and get out and do the research, where the community has their own rhythm in the village based on their subsistence hunting and the seasonal harvesting and things. And I had to constantly battle with the academic researchers I was working with, and they didn't understand the environment, and it's dangerous out there. And I know when we were out there with the ice and the seal hunting, their boat, their boat flipped in the ice, tides and things. So just trying to explain to them that, it's dangerous out there. But your own community, they're interested in mainly just going out there and doing their subsistence harvesting, and they're not really, interested in your schedule of your research. So you have to kind of work with their own timeline in your own village. And then a lot of them says, well, I don't know that topic. You'll have to talk to this elder, or that elder's, more knowledgeable about that area. So you have to be kind of really embedded in your own community on who you're going to talk to. But that's just the research I had done. Thank you.
I think I'll try to answer that question as well. It's very complex, I think, because we're not really talking about sort of bounded ontologies as if they were cultures that weren't dynamic and flux, that, there's the anthropologist's ontology and the medicals and the this, and they just sort of clash. It doesn't really quite work that way. In my experience, the argument for focusing on ontological differences becomes, well, at least in my fieldwork, it became relevant only in certain contexts. So for example, you know, with the tortilla, this argument of this is a different thing, this what you are recommending will, and you think will heal people, will harm them. So here we are sort of at this ontological equivocation. In other contexts, you know, it hasn't really been that crucial to, at least when I'm discussing with both within the community and with my academic community, to then bring up sort of this ontological difference, and not even to see it, you know, when is it visible in a way, you know, in interactions. Ways of knowing are deeply important. It's all very important. I'm just saying it's not, we should be careful of just simplifying and saying now this ontology versus that ontology in a way. And I think that I definitely had to code switch, especially in terms of talking about local knowledge as not as belief, but as knowledge, and making this point aggressively in academia. However, within the community, this has been interesting because sort of this auto-colonialist or internal colonialism had decades of forbidding the language and forbidding cultural practices, which then was replaced by a multicultural government program that suddenly began to celebrate what were called customs and beliefs. And so people in the community are quite protective of using the word beliefs. They prefer beliefs because they're meant to be respected. No? Whereas if I'm talking to the biomedical community, I talk about beliefs and they automatically think that means we can educate them away. So there is definite code switching that needs to be going on if you're trying to politically achieve something, I guess, is what I would say.
Okay, I think that we probably need to call an end to this. We did run over, and I appreciate everyone for hanging out to give everyone a chance to talk. There were a lot of interesting things to hear and to say, and so please join me in thanking our speakers. Thank you. And I guess, Alice, if you have any closing words for OPP.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. I have an ending question that maybe I'll leave us on as well, since we don't have time and people can maybe think about it. And it relates to Professor McBride's question, and it's like a lingering concern I have, and it relates to Professor Welch's introduction as well. So it's just kind of like, how can, like in things that I do as well in other philosophies, I can envision people raised in Eurocentric societies trying to reason through and grapple with some of these ways of knowing, through translating them or molding them to fit like their own conceptual schemes without necessarily using dominant categories, but like as a way of trying to make sense of things. And what are the bounds and how do we navigate between like code switching and blocking off ways of knowing while forcing other ways of knowing and facilitating learning and transformation in and through philosophy in the world. And I think like we've all been getting at that, and I just want people to think about it as we move away from this, because there's the learning process, but when is that harmful even when it's well-intentioned? And so thank you to all our speakers for speaking about their work. Thank you everyone for joining and reflecting with us. Thank you Professor Welch for chairing. Everyone who attended, you're welcome to send thoughts, suggestions, reflective art, writing to OPP. We'll consider sharing it on our website. We'll still take art for turn 4 of our journal. We're really trying to actively promote that more, though the deadline technically passed. You can still send us an email at oxfordpublicphilosophy@gmail.com. And we are recruiting for a few positions still. We're a global organization, so we're really looking for students affiliated or not with academies who would like to be a co-organizer, help run the next journal, join funding teams, events team to organize events like this. So you can email us, DM us on social media, and just thank you for joining us. And OPS, if Anna or anyone wants to say anything there, you're welcome to as well.
I don't think we have any particular closing remarks, but thank you again to all the panelists. That was really, really interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. And then we'll be posting this online soon for anyone who couldn't join us or wants to watch again. Thanks, everyone.